Let's learn a little bit of Torah. So here we go. It is such a pleasure to be learning Torah together. And a special Mazel Tov to the Lifshitz family. Just celebrated their wedding this week and coming during Shevrach as well. So let's learn a little bit of Torah together. What are we doing again? Our goal is to try to cover one chapter, one perek in Nach every week. We covered perek Aleph. If you did not get here for last week, that's fine. We're here for this week, and this week stands independent of last week. We're in perek Beis now, the second perek of Yehoshua. We're going to look at it holistically. So we're not looking at every nakuda, every word, every vowel. What we're going to be looking at is the overall picture, try to understand some of the real issues that face us today through the prism of Tanakh itself. And it really is truly remarkable. Let's start. So the topic of today is the spies again, because we've seen this before, and that's going to inform us of how we're going to appreciate, how we're going to learn this together. Our perek consists of 24 psukim, and if it sounds familiar, that is good. That means to say you were listening when Shlach was read, because this is the Haftarah of Parshas Shlach for obvious reasons. The topic of Parshas Shlach is the Meraglim, and therefore the topic of the Haftarah is Meraglim, which is what we're going to see. So this is why it should be familiar in our vernacular. Just a fun fact is you will only find Haftarahs in Nevi'im, not Ksuvim. So in the prophets, not the scriptures. So that means to say is that as we make our way through Nach, we suddenly will say, wait a second, I know that story, or I know that Haftarah, and that's because it's in Nevi'im. We won't find them when we get to Ksuvim. Let's start. Last week was the Haftarah of Parshas Bereshis, or really Simchas Torah. This is the Haftarah of Parshas Shlach. So what we're going to do is, again, as we tried last week, is to break it down into sections. We're going to look at a few key psukim which really lead us into our topic. It starts off, the first pasuk is a very important pasuk, which is Vayishlach Yehoshua ben Nun min hashitim shnaim anashim meraglim cheresh leimor lechu re'u es haaretz esirichai vayelech vayavol beis isha zona ushma rachav vayishkavu shama. So Yehoshua is now in a place called Shittim. This is in Transjordan east side. We'll look at that in a second. And he says, I'm going to send in silently these spies to go and see the land and Jericho. And they went and they arrive at the house of this woman who the word Zonah, some interpret is a innkeeper, and many interpret as a woman of the night, a prostitute. And they stay there. Then what happens is somehow it gets known that these people are coming in, and the king of Jericho is very concerned about this. They're obviously one of the border towns. They're concerned about infiltration. So he hears whisperings that they're at her house. So he sends his troops to her house asking for the spies, and she says, "Oh yeah, they did come, but they left. I didn't really know who they were." It's funny. Last week, I couldn't fall asleep one night, and I just needed something to read that I could to just, no heavy reading. And it happened to be on my kids' bookshelf. There was a book called Chasing Lincoln's Killer, and it was about the very famous story of William Booth, the actor who murdered Abraham Lincoln. And what's fascinating is like sort of you view this in that context as the killer moved his way through Maryland to get down to Virginia. Anybody he stayed at had a terrible decision to make. Do they let him in? Do they not let him in? If he was in, do they tell the authorities or not tell the authorities? And if they tell the authorities, they're going to get interrogated for collaboration, right? Meaning to say, this is what's happening over here. What do you say when the authorities knock on your door and you housed people who are treasonous? Hard questions, right? Because you say yes, they're going to ask for your... So she lies, right? She lies, she says they left, I don't know who they were. That's what a lot of people did when Lincoln's killer came in, and they were incarcerated for that, by the way. So meaning to say, she says, I don't know who they were, I sent them off, and they really left. And the practice in those days was to close the doors of the town. Jericho is one of those towns that was walled, okay? In fact, if you look into history, Jericho is one of the oldest cities known to man. If you look into the history of it. In fact, one of the claims for tourism, don't go there if you're Jewish. But anybody else in the world is allowed to go to Jericho for tourism. And you will find that they claim it's the oldest city in the world. Okay? 10,000 years, they say. They have traced things back to that. So Jericho is this old city, old Canaanite city. It's a border town, clearly. So it's walled in. They closed the doors. She said they got out beforehand. Go chase them. You can still catch them. And off they go. The troops go. They close the doors. They think they're safe. In the meantime, she's hiding them on the roof. She comes back to the roof, and now she speaks to them. Take a look. Now that's our first section. Our second section now starts, which says, so the second section is on page 2, where she says, so she's made an excuse, she's lied to the God, she comes up to them, I know that God has given the land to you. I know that everybody is terrified. How does she know? She goes on to explain, because we've been watching the wars of the Amorites. Let's just turn to a map for a second. Let's turn to page 3 for just a moment to appreciate what's going on. I know the top map is a little bit hard to read because of the size. I should have made it a little bigger. But Shittim, if you can see it, is on the right-hand side of the Jordan. That's the east side of the Jordan. That's where the nation of Israel is standing. He's sending spies into Jericho, which is just over the Jordan River to the north of the Dead Sea. That's where Jericho is. If you're coming down from Yerushalayim, you pass it on your left, okay, before you get to Route 90 at the junction there. That is where Jericho is. So where the nation of Israel is standing on the right-hand side, on the east bank of the Jordan, used to be the countries of Og and Sichon. These were Amorite nations. Israel has wiped them clean. In fact, if you're listening carefully in the relating of Parshas Chukas, and in Parashas Matos, in Chukas really is where most of the wars happen. That's where Israel cleanses that area, that region of the east side of the Jordan, which is where they're standing now. That's when Gad and Bnei Reuven say, we really like this area, it's fertile, let's stay here. So that's where they are right now. So she's saying like this: we, in the residents of the West Bank in Israel, in Canaan, have been watching what you're doing over there, and we're terrified that the same thing's about to happen to us. Notice she does not go back to Egypt. She doesn't say 40 years ago, right, because human beings are fickle, right? That means that we only relate to what we experience ourselves. When I was a kid, they told me about this Egyptian exodus and things like that. That's not what she's saying. She's saying, I'm seeing right now, in the 40th year in the desert, what's happening in Parshas Chukas, I'm seeing that. We know that it's about to happen to us. So she's very scared. She conveys this information. Now she has a request. She says, look, I'm saving you. And I already put my life on the line by lying, by sending the guards off. I have a request for you. She says, please save me and my family. And she goes on to enumerate it. Sounds like brothers, sisters, father, mother, the whole business. Please save me, do me a chesed, and save me. And that's what the deal she makes with them. And they say to her, we will do that. We will save you. But here's how it works. They say you need to stay in your apartment and place tikvas hashani, a scarlet thread or scarlet ribbon, which is going to be by the ribbon, and anybody who's in the house will survive, and anybody outside the house will not survive. Listen to the language of this, which is fascinating. I want to ask you if it reminds you of anything. She said, it's in perek Beis pasuk Yud Tes, at the bottom of page 2. Anybody who leaves the doors of your house, their blood is upon their own heads, and we are cleansed. But we will take responsibility for anybody in the house. What does that sound like to you? Like, where do we've heard this idea about? Isn't that fascinating? Yeah, so it sounds like, interesting. No, they were escaping. In this case, in the Exodus, in Egypt, we know that there was this mashchis in the 10th plague on the night of Yetzias Mitzrayim. The plague comes out, and the nation of Israel told, stay in your houses, because otherwise there'll be no differentiation, you'll be killed at the same time. And they say that, and what's interesting is what's the decoration, what's the sign they use to demonstrate that their houses are protected? They put the blood on the lintel. It's fascinating that perhaps symbolically speaking, there's this red ribbon that's hanging by the window. It's almost as if a recreation of that. We're going to have to examine this because we will see that Tanakh is specifically going to mirror some of the experiences of Egypt, exodus from Egypt and entry into Israel. Right, and obviously the most obvious one we're going to deal with in a few moments is the splitting of the sea and most people call it the splitting of the rivers. Rivers don't split, they just stop, right? Just a difference between seas and rivers, right? You just stop the river and then the other side disappears, right? We're going to see that in a moment about the Jordan. So that's going to be one obvious interesting thing. As they leave Egypt, they move through a body of water. As they enter Israel, they move through a body of water. There's going to be other similarities. It is clear Tanakh is teaching us that lesson. It's clear that Tanakh is saying this is going to be the same safe haven of those who are, we'll call it, allied to us. And they make this deal. Off they go. She lets them down through the wall because remember the doors are closed. She has a rope which she lets them down. It's interesting. Some of the Mefarshim indicate to us that that's how she used to deal with her customers. Right, because a lot of times, people would visit her at night, and the doors were closed. So she had her own, exit and entranceway. And what's fascinating over here, in a certain sense, is what she's doing is there's a reformation of her mindset. Right now, she's using perhaps her exit, what was for her business of ill repute, as a way of saving these people and aligning herself in the good, which is just fascinating in terms of what's happening with her. We'll get to her in a second. And finally, they escape. And she says a really interesting thing strategically. She says to the following. She says, go to the mountains. So let's just see where she says where this goes. She says, she says, wait 3 days in the mountains and wait and then come back because the party which is seeking you has gone to find you. Just to see this geographically, you can flip the page onto page 3. You'll just see, I just put out the relief. This is from Google Maps. Of the area as well. For those who are familiar, when you come down from Route 1, right? So Route 1 is from Jerusalem, and you know that feeling when your ears are popping as you go down from Jerusalem down to the Dead Sea, right? Because you're going down, 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 down. So that's the route, and you keep going further and further and further and further down, and you get to this huge T-junction, right? So in front of you is Jordan, to your right is the Dead Sea, and to your left is Route 90, which takes you all the way up the coast to Tiberia, right? So we're familiar with where we are right now. So Yericho is just to your left when you're doing that. That's why you start seeing the palm trees. It's called Ir HaTamarim, right? The city of date palms. So this is where it is. Notice that the mountains at that point in time, when you come to that T-junction, the mountains are behind you, right? You've been descending the mountains. In front of you is the plain, right? That's the coastal plains. Across the river of the Jordan is what's called the steppes of Moab, the Aravois Moab, that's the plains, because around the river are plains. Behind it, surrounded on both sides of the mountains, which means, listen to the strategy, what she's saying. She is saying, if you're going to the mountains, it means which direction you're moving? To the west. To the west, right? She's saying, go back towards Canaan, which means, where would the lookout party going? They're going to the Ma'abrot Sayadain. Ma'abrot is the crossings. So they must have had a bridge, a ferry of some sorts. So the pursuing party has gone eastwards because that's where any spies would have escaped. She says, the subterfuge is move westwards into the mountains, wait 3 days, allow the pursuing party to return, and then silently go back. So just without seeing the map, if you're imagine trying to explain Tanakh if you're a Mefarish in France and you've never seen Israel. Right? Today we're so blessed. We can imagine this in our own eyes. We can look at the map and see and understand what's going on. That was their strategy. It was successful. They wait 3 days. They go back. They come to Yehoshua, and the last pasuk is they give the report to Yehoshua, the top of page 3. By Mruel Yehoshua ki nasan Hashem biyadenu es kol haaretz agam namoigu kol yoshvei haaretz miponenu. The people of the land, their hearts are melted. They're not going to stand up in front of us. So this is our first episode of the Spies. Now, folks, there is like an incredibly big elephant in this room, right? So, like, if I were to ask you and say to you, what are the top 10 lessons from the Torah? And let's even narrow it down. Top 10 lessons in the Midbar if you're Israel, right? I mean, even if you get top 5, I would say like this, is don't make golden calves and don't send spies, right? They really, forget the moral things. Just don't do those things. And nonetheless, in Tanakh, we see that later on Israel, when we get to Malachim, God willing, together, then we're going to see they make 2 golden calves. But before that, we get the spies. This is the worst thing to do. This is like the biggest no-no. Last time it cost you 40 years in the desert, and suddenly you're starting to send spies now again, and it's worse than that. Who's the person who's sending the spies? Yehoshua. He was one of them. I mean, Yehoshua. Look what happened. You couldn't control them. What a terrible thing to do. And in fact, we're going to see in just a moment that perhaps even one of the spies is Kalev, which is his conspirator, the person who was with him as well. you would just think to yourself, the risks are too high. Don't do this. So we have to address that elephant in the room. There's really that is one of the biggest issues: is how could Yehoshua, thinking straight, do what it was that jeopardized the leadership of his predecessor, which jeopardized the entire generation of that generation. I'll take questions afterwards. So it's flabbergasting. So we have to acknowledge there's a really big elephant in this room. And we're going to try to address it. But in the meantime, let's try to address some of the, we'll call it smaller issues, and try to unpack them as well. What I like to do when learning is as follows, and there's different ways of learning, is sometimes what people automatically do is they say, let's learn the perek and let's turn to the mefarshim, right? So what does Rashi say? What does the Radak say? What does the Malbim say? And it's fantastic. And there are many, many commentaries on the page. But I would like to learn it slightly differently, and I don't know if I can have the hubris to say I'll call this empathetic learning, which means is let's ask the questions that what's it trying to tell us? What is Tanakh trying to tell us? And if we ask the right questions, then we will invariably meet the Mefarshim, right? Meaning, but let's understand the questions and then meet the Mefarshim there, because that's probably what they're addressing, rather than let's say what the Mefarshim are saying. Right, let's try to find the question. So a few questions. Question number one is who were these spies? Notice the Tanakh does not identify them. It does not tell us who they are. It is interesting that the Midrash Tanchuma in Parsha Shlach, at the beginning of Parsha Shlach, because this is obviously the twinned Parsha with Parsha Shlach, says that the two spies were Kalev and Pinchas. The reason why I know it's Pinchas, by the way, we didn't do the psukim inside. There's a very important pasuk which describes when she hides them. It says, she takes him to the roof and says, Vatitz Panoi. She hides him. So the Mefarshim say, him? They were them, him. Why is it in singular, right? So, by the way, you have to always learn in Hebrew, not just the summary of the story as we're doing. So they say, no, that she did not need to hide Pinchas because he rendered himself invisible. He was unable to be seen. Now, we're going to have to, when we get later on to the Eliyahu parashas, when we get to Malachim, and we start looking in Malachim Yud Ches, and we start seeing a little more about Eliyahu and his relationship to Pinchas, and this idea of Pinchas receiving some sort of covenant of peace beyond death, right? This longevity that Pinchas has, we'll see somehow that his bodily awareness became detached from him. He was no longer limited by the frailties of this world and the body, which means to say he could become not seen because he wasn't as attached to his body. That's what it sounds like. We will deal more with him later. That's not the main topic right now, but that's a interesting indicator as to what he was. But I'm going to just make an observation. That's what the Medrash tells us. But what does Tanakh tell us? And the answer is nothing. Tanakh tells us they're nondescript people. So meaning on the one hand, yes, Tanakh is injecting into us, this is what's called in academia, closed canon. Closed canon means to say is that the cast of characters that we have at the beginning of the book, we want to make sure that all of them are on stage, right? And so therefore it's going to be, from that same cohort, is going to be appearing again and again and again. And Tanakh and Chazal often do that. But in terms of just understanding the psuk, the actual pshat, it doesn't say anybody, and maybe it's actually significant. Maybe sending nondescript people is going to be perhaps a solution to the previous problems as well, as opposed to Nisiyeh Dak Anshe Shem at the beginning of Parsha Shlach. Maybe that was a problem. We have to think about that as we go further. Let's move a little further. Why did they come to Rachav's house? Meaning to say, out of all the destinations they could have chosen, why was the house of ill repute? That's the question. So, the Malbim says two phenomenal things. The Malbim says, and this makes so much sense strategically. Number one is, if you go back to Parshas Balak and Parshas Pinchas, right, this is all right, folks, we're all in the territory, right? So this is all around us. We know that one of the things that the Moabites and the Midianites did was was in the commerce, because remember, Israel's sitting around them, they set up shop, and they were selling all kinds of things, and in the way that it's described in the Midrash, which is giving the subtext to the psukim, is that when they would come into the shops, there'd be a very attractive lady behind the counter, right? And she would say, I'm willing to sell your goods, if we have a relationship, and the relationship was contingent upon their idolatry, their paganism, and as a function of that, the Bnei Yisrael sinned at Baal Peor, and they didn't do so well. Many people died at that point in time. That's the whole Pinchas story is intervening that. Now let's think about that for a second. So, if you were a Canaanite and you had to suspect where the Israelites would be going, you would think they probably learned their lesson, right? they probably are not spending too much time at the Rachav institutions, right? Because it didn't work out so well, right? So in a certain sense, militarily, this is going to be more successful, says the Malbim, because they're going to a place they would be least expected because it didn't work out last time. That's number one, militarily. But number two, says the Malbim, is another military secret as well, is this is not a low-class lady, right? She deals with a high-end clientele, which means that if you want to know what's going on politically in the country, speak to her. She knows everything that people, when they let their guard down, will say. She knows what's going on in the city. You want to know what the kings are saying, the princes, right? Unfortunately, it's a corrupt society morally. Idolatry is very much twinned in Tanakh with immorality, right? This is a paganistic society. We have relationships with all kinds of gods, and the same worked with the way they treated their relationships and their marriages. So you want to know what's going on? Speak to her. She knows what's going on. So that's why they specifically go in here. And in fact, she does have a good sense of the pulse of what's going on, as she describes it. Even if we're going to assume, as some of the Farshim say, that she's an innkeeper, it's the same logic as well. Think about how many conversations are had in the shopping, the gourmet glut shopping aisle. Have you ever been and you're like sort of walking down the aisle and you're hearing conversations which clearly should not be in public happening, in the condiment aisle. It's like no. So she knows, she's got a sense of what's happening. She's the local makolet, right? We know what happens over there. People bump into each other. They go to phone calls in the middle of this, and so she gets what's going on. They're going to her. So that's why they're over there. Now, what was their mission precisely? It's not so easy, because it does not seem at the end that they convey military information to Yehoshua. They talk about moral information, like the morale of the people. So what was their mission? That's what the Metzudas David says. He says they are mechapsim umachshavos habriyos im nomes levavenu. They were just trying to find out what the morale of the people are. How hard are we going to have to fight? Are these people going to fight us? Or they're just like timidly going away. That's what the Metzudas David says. However, I would like to bring into play a person that we don't get to see often in Tanakh. We're going to step out of the page, because remember the Mikras Gedolos limits the palette of our Mefarshim. We're going to look at the Chomas Anach. Does anybody know who that is? Chomas Anach is the Chida, Rav Chaim Yosef David Azulai. Remarkable, one of the most prolific authors, right? So the Chida is unbelievable. And he has a commentary on Tanakh called the Chomas Anach. He has a commentary on almost everything. And in this, he says a beautiful thing. He says, that, and perhaps we'll read this inside because it really is a very interesting observation, which we will not get elsewhere, in source 4. At the end of the first line, he says, Va'arav ma'arav Yosef pai mita zal av based in. He says of Anuka Bidrash Arsov says Pirush daha Emorayim bekishufim atzomim hichrichu mazikim sheyeshu Pesach yirichoi uvachama. The people of Jericho were deeply entrenched in sorcery and witchcraft, and what they did was they set incantations upon the walls and upon the gates of Jericho as a protection, not just physical fortification, but we'll call it black magic fortification as well. And so he sent two, we'll call it experts in spiritual witchcraft, people who had a sense of the unknown spiritual, and that's why it says cheresh lemor, loshon charashim v'kishufim. He says he sent them to untie some of the spells or some of the incantations laid upon the walls. You ever thought about that? And he says that's why it is. If you ever wondered, when we're going to discuss the walls of Jericho, why is it that they walked around it 7 times, 1 per day and 7 on the 7 days? Right? It wasn't just because they were trying to create the Hoshanas on Sukkot, right? That's where it comes from, right? It was because somehow that process was untying some of the dark forces, the dark ideas which were actually put into the walls itself. Fascinating on a more spiritual level, and that's their job as well. So it's less military, seems to be more spiritual military, right? It's Unit 8200 on a different level, right? So they're going in on a different mission. Now, let's imagine you are Rachav for a moment. You have a knock on the door, and these are Israelites. They're clearly not Canaanites. Different dialect, even if they've put on the language, they're clearly speaking with an accent. You know these people. You know that right across the river. You can see them, right, in Jericho. You can see across the Jordan River. It's not the Mississippi, right? You can see over there on the other side. You know what's going on. You know that these people are coming from that direction. You know where they are. Why would you aid them? Why would you? And this comes down to, I think, the messiest part of war. War is a very difficult business. And war puts you in very difficult situations. So like as an example, as the Nazis conquered Europe and they crossed, in short order, crossed in Europe from the west and then ultimately to the east. The first thing they did was they killed all the collaborators, right? So, and anybody who was seen to be against their forces, they'd hang them in the public square. But it worked the other way too. It worked the other way too as well. So as an example, if you read about, let's say in Greece, when Greece was taken over by the Italian and then German forces, right? So when they were pushed back, as the Allies moved in, the first thing the partisans did was to kill any of the people who fraternized with the Germans, right? Any girlfriends the Germans had who were Greek were killed right away. That was the first thing that happened as the Germans were pushed back, right? Same thing in Vichy, France. This is an article I just read about this over here. This picture over here is a picture of a woman who was a Nazi fraternizer, a French woman, and what they did was they shaved all their heads and beat them in public for their fraternization after D-Day, right? And you can understand on both sides, war is a dirty business. War is a very difficult business. It forces regular civilians to have to make very difficult decisions which may cost their lives, the lives of their families and children. Very difficult decisions. Rachav is being put in that moment now, because you see, if she ignores them, she may be killed by them. But if she doesn't ignore them and they win the war, she'll be killed by her own. It's a very, very difficult decision of the average civilian being put in the middle of this. And I don't think we don't have enough empathy for where she stands in this regard. And this is the decision she makes. What she's doing essentially is she's saying, I'm a betting woman, right? At the very least, forget spiritual aspirations for a second. As a betting woman, I'm betting on your horse, right? I understand that you're going to be winning and I'm going to be with you. That's the most basic level of what Rachav is doing. We're going to see in a moment there's more to it than that, but understand the decision she makes has a cost. If they were to lose this battle the first time around, she will be hanged in the public square. Right? That's how it's going to be. The way Hamas does it is they drag people behind on motorbikes, right, on the ground. That's how war works. Is any collaborators are killed publicly. So she's taking a big risk. So the question is, why do they end up helping her? Meaning, on what grounds do they respond to her and they say, yeah, we're going to give you a guarantee of safety? And so the language, we do not look at the language itself, but the language she says and they say a number of times is a very fascinating language. Take a look at, if you just squeeze back to page 2, Pasuk Yudad is an important language. Listen to their response to her. So it's on the left-hand side in the middle of page 2. Vayamru la anashim nafshenu tachtechem lamus. Our souls are in your hand to die. If you don't tell our matter now. Because remember, although she's already spilled the beans, she's told them the information they need, they still are in her hands. She could easily just, tell her neighbor and then they're dead. Right? They're very much vulnerable to her. And God gives us the land, we will do with you kindness and truth. Kindness and truth are different things. And the Radak points out that truth is to her. Kindness is to her family. So the calculus is as follows. You saved our lives. We owe you al-pi-emes. Truth, we owe you our lives. That's in terms of their life. But chesed is your family. We don't need to say your family. We're willing to deal with your family. This is a very complicated decision they have to make. Because remember, these are officers. These are not privates, right? So they do have decision-making capacity in their espionage. But think about the decisions they have to make, because now they're going to have to go back to their commander. Their commander may say no, right? But they're giving her the guarantee. They're giving her the ticket out because they believe that first of all, they owe their lives to her. They're even going to do kindness to their families. This gets down to a really complex issue, and I think it's something we need to think about today. It's an issue that we really, as Jews, need to consider. And that is the relationship of Jews to non-Jews around them at the time that Israel is ascendant. Not descendant, but ascendant. Remember, now we're moving into the greatest power at this moment in time. People are terrified. They're about to walk into the land of Israel. They're about to take over. They're about to be the controllers of the land. How do you relate to people who want in? right, who want to be part of you. Not so simple. Listen to this interesting halacha. The Rambam says that, let's say, look at source 7. The Rambam tells us in Hilchos Isribia, there's about Gerus, he says, Lefichach lekiblu based in Gerim, kol yemei David Shlomo. Says the Rambam that you would not accept converts to Judaism during the times of David and Shlomo. Why not? David Shema mina pachad chazru. Maybe the converts at the times of David were because of fear militarily. David was conquering the entire region. Maybe in the times of Shlomo wasn't because of military economy. Look how well Israel was doing. It was the center of commerce in the known world at the time of Shlomo Melech. Of course people went in. It says, if a person is wants to come to Judaism for ulterior motives, that's not real conversion. So what did they do? As people find a way, right? So the central council is not accepting them as gerus. They made small councils. They made breakaways, right? Little shtibbles where they did their gerus on the side. And he says, based in Agadol, but the Beis Din Agadol would not give them accreditation, so they had a gerus issue, much like we have today in Israel. And so the Beis Din Agadol, the centralized rabbinate, would not accept these people. It says, but they didn't push them away. They waited a little bit. Let's see how it plays out. Let's see, in 10 years when there's a downturn in the economy, when the mortgage is not coming out so right, are you still with it? Right, that was the question. It raises a really interesting question: is what happens when somebody wants in when we are ascendant? I just mentioned to people before. I read a book recently when I was sick. Called The Prophet in the Andes, about this remarkable family, the Villanova family, who were these Peruvian Christians and their journey to Judaism through their own intellectual integrity. Amazing. These people literally went through the Bible and then they went through things and they said, it says circumcision. It doesn't mean circumcision of the heart like Christianity is teaching us. It says of the flesh. At that point in time, some of the group said, I don't think so. But nonetheless, the rest of the group did. And the Jews wouldn't circumcise them, because they were suspicious of them. They got themselves circumcised as grown men. They started keeping kashrus. They started keeping Pesach like it says in the Bible. Then they found a Kitzur Shulchan Aruch in Spanish. Crazy. For 20 years these people grew and found they were literally living a Jewish lifestyle with no teacher, just on their own integrity. Finally, this organization, Shavei Yisrael, found them, and they brought a base into Peru, and they converted these people. They moved to Israel, actually moved to Elon Moreh. And this whole group of them, and then there was the second tier of them couldn't make the conversion because they didn't know halacha good enough, and the Bnei Moshe Kehillah in Peru, they made them themselves, and they sent another delegation and brought them in, and then more and more kept coming, and Israel said, let's slow down. Why did Israel say let's slow down? Because understand what happens like this: the first group of them were literally what the sacrifices they made is One of them won the Chidon HaTanakh in Peru against all the Jews. That's how well they knew Tanakh, right? The Jews were very not happy with that. But not only that's how he first went to Israel and the whole thing. But the first group of them really made sacrifices. But then what happens is, as they start sending letters back to their cousins and saying, listen, we live in abject poverty. If you ever looked at Peru and these South American countries to a large degree, you have people who never will stand a chance of ever improving their life, ever. Right? It's such a disparity between the rich and the poor. It's a failed country, as most of the countries in the world are. And these people have no way out. And now their cousin sends them a letter. We get a house. we get a sal klita. We get this whole business. So they say, Judaism sounds good. Not just because it sounds good, but also good. It's a way out. The right of return applies to Jews. Let's become Jewish. Think about this. Your average Christian Peruvian has no right to return to any other country, right? There's no one saving them. But Jews care for each other. So the government of Israel said, let's slow down, right? After the first few waves of them. And that's the same question over here. Is how do you deal with somebody who says, and Rachav is the first prototype of a person who says, I want in, I see you're right. And it might, is it just militarily, as I argued beforehand? Or is it no, spiritually, aspirationally, I see your God is the one. And she mentions God. She says, I see God is going to destroy the Amorites and the Canaanites. How do you deal with this? And the first time we encounter this idea is they're welcoming. They welcome her in. And they even welcome her family, which is fascinating. This is going to be a struggle Judaism has the whole time. You should know that I once went to a liberal think tank in Lod. And it's just very fascinating to sort of hear. They work very closely with the Israeli Arab population, trying to enfranchise the Israeli Arab population. And they're saying, the percentage of Arab Israelis in high-ranking jobs in Israel is lower than the percentage, and they're trying to get them into and in this way to create more ties. Okay. We can argue and go back and forth about the value of this in a Jewish state, the only Jewish state in the world. But nonetheless, one of the things that they said, which was an interesting observation, is they said, Israel has not yet learned how to be the dominant force in its own country. Meaning, you need to learn how to be the victor. And that's an interesting observation, meaning, how are you the dominant force? How are you the ascendant, and how do you relate to others? That's the story with Rach over here, which is happening over here. Now, and by the way, so what ended up happening? Remember the Rambam says, with the converts of the times of David and Shlomo, they said, let's wait and see what happens. That's what the Israeli government said to these people in Peru, let's wait and see. What did happen? What's interesting is the Gemara tells us in Megillah that in fact, Rachab herself did convert to Judaism, and she became the matriarch of many people in Tanakh. For instance, their names were Neriah, Baruch ben Neriah, that's his father and him, Saraya, Machasya, Yirmiyah, Chilkiah, and Chanamel, and Shalom. So she became a patriarch of quite a nation. Where did it come from? The Gemara goes on to say that she ended up marrying Yehoshua, which is remarkable. Now think about this for a moment, because think about her perspective. We're going to see this as an interesting model in terms of, we'll call the models of meritocracy. You'd say like this: look, this lady, is she going to really make it into the Israelite community? And somehow she's going to ascend the ranks to the top, right? If this Gemara is to be taken literally, that means to say is that this Gemara is saying is that the notion of the doors being open to those who want in, those who are really committed, are fully open. There's no bars, there's no glass ceilings if you really want in. And we're going to see in a few moments, Be'ezrat Hashem, in a few weeks' time, when we get to a fellow called Achan who lives with blue blood, he comes to the tribe of Yehuda, and the whole thing is he sinks to the very bottom. And we're going to see that in a certain sense, Tanakh is going to be arguing that it's based on your actions, not your lineage, in this respect, which is a very important thought process to appreciate over here. Let's come back to our question, because our time is closing, and that is, how in the world could Yehoshua send Meraglim? Isn't this the worst thing to do? So already all the Mefarshim try to explain this, and the Malbim goes on to give 5 separate reasons as to why this distinguishes itself from the Meraglim of Parashat Shlach, and why he is doing it differently. He observes, number 1, is that when it came to the Meraglim of Moshe Rabbeinu and Shlach, it was a delegation of the people, whereas over here it was a delegation of the leader. I want to just dig into that for just a moment and appreciate this. Rav Hirsch points out this point as well, is like this, is that we live in an age of information sharing, right? And so we think as the proletariat that we are entitled to all information, to judge every situation ourselves. That's not a very healthy thing. Meaning to say like this: there is due process, and information is sensitive and needs to be mediated. So says Rav Hirsch, what the problem was with the Meraglim? Is they gave sensitive military information to the people. It's like kind of as if they had social media. Think about this for a second, right? So here you have a military spy going in and sharing on Twitter their observations to the people. You can imagine that the unwashed masses are going to be very scared because they don't know how to deal with that information, right? It's illegitimate for military personnel to give information to the proletariat because the proletariat simply is uneducated to be able to appreciate that information. That's what it says Rav Hirsch is the problem. It's such a brilliant observation. Where do you report espionage to? To the top brass. It's behind closed doors in a basement in Tel Aviv. That's what happens. They will tell you in a few years' time when they decide to declassify that information, what happens. There has to be there's a process of mediation of information. We today, it's like the same thing. People are like, we want to see the body cams of the police. It's like, the police department has a due process. They will review the body cams, and there's a due process of cross-examining their officers and seeing what actually happened. It's not the person 7 states down to look at the body cam and say, oh my gosh, we're going to riot, because there's a process. Obviously, there's an important that there is public information, because otherwise you can lead to dictatorship regimes. But the first point that Malbim says is the difference between who is sending and who's receiving the information. That's really important. This delegation was sent by Yehoshua and reported to Yehoshua. The other delegation was a rabble who said, we want spies. They came back and they spoke to the rabble. And without an opportunity to be able to explain the information, people got very excited. And that's what happened. It's really important to think about in today's special information sharing society where it is to the detriment of the average person. The next thing he says is that the spies of Moshe were from a distance. They were in the Midbar Paran, which is the south region. They weren't close to Israel. So it made it seem as if, are we going, rather than we're going, but let's find out. Right? As opposed to here, they can see into Israel. It's clear that they're going in. Number 3 is, he points out, is the difference between the word meragel and lasur. The word meragel does not appear in Parsha Shlach altogether. It's interesting, we call them meraglim, but they're not really meraglim. Lasur is to assess. Meragel is to spy. Yehoshua sent spies, they sent assessors. The assessors were saying, what's it like? How do we think about it? Right? And therefore, that once you get to assessment, it makes it, you know how it goes. When you're in leadership, you don't ask questions you don't want the answer to. Right? You don't send out surveys you don't want the answer to. So they sent out a survey they didn't want the answer to. That was a problem. The Malbim says number 4 is, this was silent. It wasn't like the people were reporting, in the Jewish Gazette of the morning. It says, spies leave. It's like, that's detrimental. It doesn't work. And whereas Moshe's Rabbeinu was public. And finally, their job was to go to one city and report in that one city which was on the border. It was not to go to the whole land. It wasn't to make an assessment north to south, east to west. It was very specific. So it seems much more military, much more pinpoint, which the Malbim suggests. I'd like to close with two other possibilities, which I think are very, very powerful. And these, again, we're moving off the page of the book. And they are to the words of the Ahavas Yonatan. Does anybody know who wrote the book Ahavas Yonatan? Excellent, good. Rav Yonasan Abishitz wrote a book on the Haftarah. Did anybody know that? He wrote a book called Ahavas Yonatan on the Haftarah. And on that, so being as a Haftarah, we also have Rav Yonasan Abishitz's observations. He makes 2 observations which I think are incredibly powerful, and we'll close with these observations. Number 1 is, he says as follows. Israel's been living a pretty supernatural existence right now, right? So meaning like there's clouds, there's manna, there's water, there's a whole business, mountains closing, killing people, that's in Parshas Chukas, there's a lot of things going on. So the people of the Canaanite and Amorite origins are busy looking across the river and they're saying like, we don't stand a chance. No, we're dead. But then suddenly they hear there's spies being sent. Now when you send spies, that means to say you're operating under standard military operating procedures, right? They said, ooh, that's great. If they're now using military strategy, it means to say miracles are ending. If miracles are ending, we stand a fighting chance. Which means to say the spies itself was a red herring. The spies itself was to lower the guard of the people of the land, because why would they if they can just destroy us? Now, this question itself is going to be essentially important as we learn of Yehoshua. How miraculous and how mundane is this book? Is going to be a central question we're going to have to ask ourselves. The walls of Jericho are going to fall. What about the next city? Ha'ai? Not quite. Right? How miraculous is this going to be? That's the question. By sending spies, they're downgrading. They're making it seem like it's a military operation. Every drops their guard. That's the first thing. And the second thing he says is as follows. And this is the last point we will end as well. Is look at source 12, and I'd like to read it together. It says, Achen gabe Moshe shechatu Yisrael ba'arvos Moav, but samdu l'Baal Peor. The nation of Israel, they sinned in Baal Peor, they sinned on the steps of Moab with the immorality. V'lo yuru'uyim l'neis neged ha'teva, lochein hutzrach Moshe lishlach meraglim, terem yikrevu la'milchama ve'asuru es haaretz. Maybe they needed to send spies because they do not warrant miraculous intervention anymore. Why? Because of their sin at Baal Peor. V'yadu mamar ha'Gemara. The Gemara says, Hey chidami Baal Teshuvah. How do you know a person is a real Baal Teshuvah, a person who does a full repentance for their sins? It's in the same place, in the same situation, and you don't give in to your desires. Shalach Yehoshua meraglim min hashitim came isham taschilu lezanois achar Baal Peor. He sent them from the place where they sinned at Baal Peor, where the immorality led them to decimation. Maybe he sent the meraglim as a microcosm of the nation of Israel to the house of ill repute, not to engage with her in order to fix what caused them so much detriment beforehand. Is that fascinating? Meaning to say, morally, we're going to move into the land and we're going to show you that the way we're going to wage war is not the way wars are usually waged. Wars are dirty, not just because of collateral damage, but relationships. There's so much suffering that goes on, and relationships, women and soldiers and all things, and foreign nationals and all that complication. We're going to send our men in chaste. It's going to be pure, because we're going to show you now that we're not going to be doing as we lived beforehand. This is going to be a pure moral war which is going to be fought, and which is why it's done specifically. So in a certain sense, this was not really actually outward facing at all according to this. This is inward facing. This is about setting the moral compass for the nation of Israel as they move in over here. Lots of fascinating concepts. Concepts of dealing with Israel in ascendancy. Concepts with dealing with those who want in. Concepts with meritocracy. Concepts when it comes to the ideas of natural versus supernatural. The concepts over here of what the level of morality as we fight the morale of the others. There's so many things which apply to us today. This is Perek Beis, Be'ezras Hashem. We continue next week, Perek Gimel. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming.